On March 4th of 1861, Abraham Lincoln became the 16th President of the United States. It was his inauguration day, his first day on the job, and he was prepared to speak to the country about his feelings of unity and togetherness. And yet, problems had faced the president even before his inauguration. Within days of his election in November of 1860, the country was already becoming unraveled. James Buchanan, the outgoing president, had managed to keep the country together for 4 years through a series of compromises that allowed for the expansion of slavery. When Lincoln became president, taking over for James Buchanan, he could no longer keep it together. South Carolina had seceded from the Union, and the path had been set for the American Civil War. Barely 1 month after his inauguration, the war had begun. Fort Sumter in flames. It was a muggy April morning near Charleston, South Carolina. Families gathered up food in picnic baskets, strolled up the hills overlooking the United States fort, Fort Sumter. Friends exchanged greetings and smiles. The news had spread quickly through the town. There was going to be a good show. The Confederates were going to bombard the Union-held fort. What a great chance for some excitement. This may have been what things looked like for those people on the hill overlooking Charleston Harbor. When the soldiers at the fort, Union soldiers, ran low on food, President Lincoln sent a supply boat to the men. He told South Carolina's Confederate governor that the boat would not have any guns or soldiers. The Confederates, however, refused to allow this or any other boats near the fort. In fact, they demanded that the fort surrender, to wave the white flag. You know, to give up. Robert Anderson, the Union commander at the fort, said, "We will not surrender." He and his 68 men braced for an attack. On April 12, 1861, barely a month after President Lincoln's inauguration, Confederate P.G.T. Beauregard ordered his troops to fire cannons at the fort. It was a bombardment. Fort Sumter went up in flames, and Anderson surrendered after 2 days. This was the true beginning of the Civil War. Interesting fact, despite heavy firing or bombardment, not one man, not one soldier died during the actual attack on Fort Sumter. Nevertheless, during the surrender ceremony, Private Daniel Hugh was accidentally killed, and several soldiers were wounded. The ceremonial gunfire, which took place as the Union flag was coming down and the South Carolina state flag was going up, the ceremonial gunfire accidentally sparked a small explosion that ignited a case of gunpowder. A tragic end. The major people involved in this episode, the Union commander, Robert Anderson, and the Confederate general, P.G.T. Beauregard. Today, you're going to learn about other battles of the Civil War. You're going to keep a kind of scorecard in which you'll use the same kind of information that you just saw about the Battle of Fort Sumter. For example, you'll need to know the major players. You'll need to know who claimed to have a victory. Notice when I say claimed victory, that doesn't mean that there was an agreement about who actually won the battle. But before you do that, I have something else for you. Take a look at some of the words in these paragraphs. And take a look at what people actually saw. Families gathered up food in picnic baskets. The news spread quickly through the town. There was going to be a good show. What a great chance for some excitement. This may seem strange to us 150 years after the events, knowing now what we know about war, the Civil War in particular, and its terrible destruction. But that's true. People did actually gather around Fort Sumter thinking that they might see a great entertainment. Now, Fort Sumter was the first battle of the Civil War, but it wasn't a field battle, not the kind of battle that we're used to thinking of. It was more of a bombardment. But the same thing, or something rather similar, happened on the very first field battle, called the Battle of Bull Run, sometimes called Manassas by people in the South. Take a look. On July 21st, 1861, many civilians or non-military people gathered on the hills overlooking Manassas, Virginia, to see the first field battle of the American Civil War. They expected, as they had before at Fort Sumter, an entertaining event. They were instead confronted by a terrifying spectacle of violence and death. At least 900 soldiers were killed in the day's fighting in one day, and more than 2,500 suffered terrible injuries. Surprisingly, over 1,200 people were missing after the battle, nearly all of them from the Union side. This suggests that the number of people who died may have actually been much higher. People had gathered to see this event and were shocked to see the terrible costs of war. There had never been a war that in many people's living memories on the soil of the United States. They didn't know what to expect. They didn't know to expect the terrible violence. Now here's an interesting fact. Oddly enough, this first major battle, the one that took place on the fields of the Civil War, took place on the land owned by a man named Wilmer McLean. His land was devastated by the destructive battle, of course, and as a result, McLean moved many miles away. He bought a new home in a place called Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Appomattox Courthouse is actually the complete name of the village. So the war started on somebody's property, the front yard, so to speak, of Mr. McLean. Now, when the war came to an end, years later, April 1865, Generals Lee and Grant signed the peace treaty, or peace agreement, in Appomattox. Where precisely? It was none other than the new home purchased by Wilmer McLean. Wilmer McLean, after the war later, made a very interesting observation. He said, "The war began in my front yard and ended in my front parlor." In other words, it started in front of his house and ended in his living room. That's just one of many interesting facts that you're going to learn today as you complete your Civil War Scorecard. You're going to look through the reading material and you're going to skim each of the passages to try to find the information to keep track of the score. When did a battle like the Battle of Bull Run or the Battle of Shiloh take place? Where did it take place? Which state? Which city? Be as specific as you can. It's a scorecard, so don't worry about complete sentences. I also want you to make a note of who claimed victory. As I said earlier, not everybody agreed on who actually won. And sometimes, well, you'll see, it wasn't as simple as it appears. Who were the major leaders or the major players in these battles? And on top of that, there's one extra question that I want you to answer for each one. For example, when you read more about the Battle of Bull Run, the battle that famously began in Wilmer McLean's front yard, you're going to read about a kind of terrifying scream, something that the Confederates used to do to scare their enemies. We don't know exactly what this scream sounded like. Oh, we have some idea. But we definitely know what people on both sides called that terrifying scream. Pay attention to vocabulary like counterattack and interesting facts like how Union General McClellan got a very nice turn of events, a nice bit of luck at one of the most important battles, Antietam. At the very end, I want you to skim the passages about General Lee and General Grant. Which side did they fight for? And there are a couple of questions about them. As with all the other passages, don't worry about complete sentences. It's a scorecard. On your way out, before you begin, take a look at these primary sources that show actual photographs and engravings after the fact of the Civil War.